Welcome, esteemed guests, to the 38th installation of our LSE Ideas Russia-Ukraine Dialogue Series, initiated in the aftermath of the February 2022 escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war. This ongoing dialogue is made possible through partial funding from PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, dedicated to providing research and tracking data on conflict and its resolution. Next month will mark 2 years since the escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war. Since February 2022, the grim toll of the war includes the loss of nearly 10,000 Ukrainian civilians, with more than 700,000 Ukrainian children being kidnapped by Russia's own estimates and taken to Russia for indoctrination. The impact of the war in Ukraine extends further, with 3.7 million internally displaced people and 6.3 million forced to seek refuge abroad. According to preliminary estimates by Ukraine's economic ministry, its GDP has rebounded by 5% in 2023 after a drastic 28.8% plunge in 2022. Still, a staggering 14.6 million Ukrainians, approximately 40% of the population, will this year require humanitarian assistance. Moreover, US officials, as reported by the New York Times in August, estimated that the Ukrainian military death toll to be close to 70,000. A declassified US intelligence report revealed that Russia has suffered 315,000 dead and injured troops, amounting to nearly 90% of its personnel it had 2 years ago. More recently, the UK Ministry of Defense predicted that if current casualties persist, 500,000 Russian personnel will be killed and wounded by 2025. The aftermath of the February escalation has triggered significant global responses, including unprecedented sanctions against Russia, the activation of temporary protection mechanism for refugees, widespread energy diversification in Europe, the revival of the EU enlargement policy, and significant increases in defense spending among EU member states. As we convene for today's panel discussion, our aim is to take the pulse of these developments. Expert panelists will delve into the impact of the war on Ukraine, its immediate region, and the broader global order. Moreover, they will peer into the future, contemplating what to anticipate in 2024 and beyond. Key questions guiding our exploration include what transpired, what is the current situation, and most importantly, where are we heading? That said, I'd like to welcome today's distinguished panelists. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tamara Kurchenko, an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria, assistant director of UVic's Institute for Integrated Energy System, and chair of the Local Governance Hub. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Natalie Tocci, director of Istituto Affari Internazionali and part-time professor at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. She has also been special advisor to EU High Representatives Federica Mogherini and Josep Borrell. Last but not least, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Michael Cox. He is the founding director of LSE Ideas and currently a visiting professor at the Catholic University in Milan. I should also add that Michael Cox is also the editor of the brand new LSE publication, Russia's War and the Future of the Global Order. And in fact, both of the other panelists have also contributed a chapter each to this book, and I will include a link to this book for our audience in the Zoom chat. Now, let's first turn to Tamara. Tamara, what have been the defining impacts of the February 2022 escalation of the war on Ukraine? Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you, Dr. Hartwell, and thank you for having me. Asking this question brings me back to February 2022, and it's personal for me because I'm Ukrainian Canadian. My family live in Eastern Ukraine, and my sister and her family live in Kyiv, or did, because they're now in Germany as the bombs are falling on the capital. They have young kids. So for me, this is partly a personal answer, and for years I listened to Russian discourse as it grew more openly dehumanizing of Ukrainians, and I knew it was for a reason. And a defining impact for me is, now that we know why, that this is a war of elimination. It's in discourse, indeed, it's genocidal. And as you just did, we can put numbers to these defining impacts. hundreds of thousands killed, mass rape, torture, children stolen, entire cities destroyed, ecocide, herbicide. And when that happens, things become very black and white. And the defining impacts of Russia's full-scale invasion, in my opinion, are to galvanize a nation to survive. And the defining impact is the remarkable way that Ukrainian people and community have of organizing collective support and responses and resistance, that despite everything, they have proven that this is a resilient society. Russia will, in fact, not be able to eliminate Ukraine or Ukrainians as a nation or people, even though it's trying. And the war has, of course, changed Ukraine forever. It's in the worst possible circumstances given Ukraine a global stage, and this too is a defining impact. And people have discovered Ukraine. A lot of places have become more Ukrainian. The city where I live is more Ukrainian as Ukrainian refugees are coming. A final defining impact that I'd like to mention is anti-colonialism. Ukraine wholly rejects Russian imperialism and colonialism. And in doing that, it's really defining itself and celebrating what it means to be Ukrainian as a multi-ethnic democracy. And a lot of other nations and peoples are making these connections too, and these anti-colonial spaces growing across, Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And I think, excuse me, it's also solidified even more the direction of the country that people want and demand dignity, freedom, democracy. They're committed to European integration. So beyond surviving, this is also what Ukrainians are fighting and dying for. And to me, those are the defining impacts.
Thank you, Tamara. And I also especially appreciate your point that you mentioned about the self-discovery of Ukrainians and starting to talk more and more about decolonization of Ukraine, which is a topic that we start to turn back to increasingly. Now I'm going to turn to Natalie to talk a little bit more about the regional implications of this war. Natalie, welcome again. Despite historical divisions on Russia-related issues, the EU has largely maintained a united policy response to the February 2022 escalation, including unanimous agreement on sanctions. Now, how sustainable is this unity? And are there foreseeable challenges that might test the EU solidarity in the coming months and years? Thank you, Natalie.
Well, thank you, Leon, and it's wonderful to be here. I think this is actually probably the most positive thing that I'm going to be saying over the course of this meeting. And in general, I must say that on Ukraine, but also beyond Ukraine, the usual optimistic me is really kind of beginning to have a bit of an identity crisis. However, on this particular question, I actually remain fairly optimistic. So firstly, let me say that, as you, I think, rightly pointed out, Russia has traditionally been amongst the most divisive issues within the EU. I mean, this is something that is not new. It has always been this way. And so I think the fact that sort of courtesy Vladimir Putin and what he's done, particularly after February 22, there has been unity. I mean, I think this in and of itself is actually something that, talking about European foreign policy, where in a sense division is and has always been the mother of all ills, I think is something worth noting. Now, you could say, well, hardly surprising. I mean, what Putin did at that point, I mean, he'd done lots of other things before, but what he did at that point was really kind of so extreme, so obscene that, I mean, it really would have taken, something to be divided over it. And I think you would be right, in the sense it's not that surprising that in February, March, April 2022, that unity prevailed. It starts being more surprising, more remarkable, more significant, given that here we are, approaching the end of the second year of this war, and that unity still holds. Let's not forget the fact that, I remember very well sort of going back to the summer of the first year of the war. So, the debates, the European debate back in, say, June, July 2022, there was already a suspicion of, oh, is that unity beginning to fray? Are we seeing a division between the peace camp and the justice camp, or the compromise camp as opposed to the, sort of victory camp, however you want to characterize it. That division has not materialized. And again, I think that here we are sort of 2 years on, and at least on this particular point, which indeed is in a sense symbolized by the consensus over now 12 packages of sanctions, has prevailed. Now, if you then ask me to sort of look into the future, yes, but is that consensus going to sort of survive in the months and years ahead? I actually think that so long as Putin behaves as Putin, I actually think that when it comes to the European position, we can talk about the US later on, but when it comes to the European position, I actually struggle to see the political dynamic that would lead to a division. Now, if Putin decides not to be Putin and kind of play in a smarter way, say, for example, pretending that he wants negotiations, pretending that he wants compromise, yes, at that point, I think we enter danger zone, right? In the sense that those divisions would very easily resurface. Here I am sitting in Rome. I could very well imagine those divisions resurfacing and, countries like my own beginning to say, whoa, maybe we should be compromising. But so long as Putin behaves like Putin, I actually think that we're quote unquote on fairly safe grounds. Now, then it becomes, but then perhaps, I'll leave this to a different question. Does that unity translate into doing what it takes in terms of supporting Ukraine? That becomes a different conversation, it's a policy conversation. But the political conversation, I actually think it's probably the most optimistic thing that I'm going to say over the course of the next 50 minutes or so.
Thank you, Natalie. And I'm glad we started off on a positive note then, if it's going to get bleaker from there, but maybe we can weave in something more positive in the end. Mick, I'm going to turn to you now to also give us a little bit of the bigger picture. Let me just start off by saying I really enjoyed reading your new LSE ideas your LSE publication that you edited, because it gave me a chance to kind of reflect about the last 2 years. It's been a really busy, fast-paced 2 years, and I thought all your authors did a great job of kind of looking back and reflecting on what has happened. So you've obviously had to edit all these chapters, and I'm hoping that you did a lot of thinking in the process. So my question to you is, in hindsight, what did political analysts and theoreticians of war, whether we're talking about in the West or in Eastern Europe, get wrong about the Russia-Ukraine war? Thank you, Mick.
Well, thanks, Leon, and great to see tomorrow my friend Natalie from Italy. And they were major contributors to the book that you've so fulsomely praised, so thank you for that. And thanks to the other 13 or 14 contributors. It was, in a sense, a snapshot of where we are now, and we may be, I think as implied, we may be in a slightly different place 6 months, 1 year down the line. So it's not a prediction about the future. But again, it was great doing the book and pulling it together and trying to provide both the things that Tamara talks about so well and so passionately, look at the European and look at the German dimensions, look at the American dimension, but also look at the global dimension. I see this war really, without minimizing the impact of other conflicts going on in the world, I see this as an early defining war of the 21st century. Yes, I do. And I think its global consequences are going to live with us for a very, very long time indeed, whatever the outcome. It is a world event. And that's how I tried to cast the book. Now, you've asked me that old question, what did people get wrong? And I suppose the simplest answer is we got most things wrong, I think, very early on, to be perfectly honest. I mean, let's be fair to the American intelligence community for once, because people very often aren't. But they probably got it right. They kind of did say by October, every indication they got was there's going to be a war. He isn't mucking about. And then we know that Joe Biden sent over the head of the CIA to tell Putin, we know what you're up to, Vlad. And it didn't make any difference. And then they told the Chinese, we know what the Russians are going to do. But the British, to some degree, went along with that, and indeed, I think so did Poland. But quite a lot of Europeans and others and experts who really thought they knew the story just didn't think it was going to happen. And it was a bit of a huge intellectual failure. They just thought Putin would play all sorts of other games, but he wouldn't take the chance or make the risk of taking for a full-scale invasion, which he did in February 24th of 2020. And I suppose we do have to ask the question as to why. Having got it right, I think then most people got something, what the CIA, I think, and the intelligence community got right. They then got something else wrong. And this brings me back to what Tamara said at the very beginning of her comments. They didn't think Ukraine would survive. You know, the truth of the matter is, even if you, and Putin didn't think that either. So the miscalculations weren't about analysts sitting in the BBC or Deutsche Welle or, you know, Corriere della Sera in Italy, not you, Natalie, but you know what I mean. They thought there wasn't going to be a war, and there was one. And you've got to ask the question, why did they think that? But secondly, why did they think, and most of them thought this, I think this is fair to say, Tamara, then thought Ukraine would be overrun, Kiev would be overrun within 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. That was Putin's calculation and clearly large sections. And that brings us back as to how Ukraine managed to survive in those first few weeks. How it's managed to endure what it's endured, as Tamara described so well and so passionately and so correctly. And so those are the two things I think we got wrong. I think there's another thing that we got wrong, and there were certain things we did get right. I think we haven't quite come up with solving the problem. Do we want Ukraine just to not be defeated, or do we want Ukraine to win? And I don't think in the policy community, it's not right or wrong. It is that this is a policy dilemma. It seems that the West, as Natalie implied, has done enough to make sure Ukraine is not defeated. And that would be a disaster, not only for Ukraine, but for the West. But also, have they done enough? And this is a policy question, isn't it? And I don't have an easy answer to this. Have they done enough to allow Ukraine to win, if Ukraine can win? And I think that's going to be the big policy driver going forward, particularly coming in to the US elections in November.
Thank you, Mick. And I think on that last point, that's incredibly important, because our goals from the get-go will determine how we act in the coming months, of course, on either side of the Atlantic. All right, let's turn again to tomorrow. We're going again to Ukraine. A focus on Ukraine specifically. Can you tell us about Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction needs after 2 years of a full-scale invasion? Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Great points, Dr. Cox and Dr. Tachi. The needs are, of course, immense. So the Kyiv School of Economics, together with others, is documenting reports on damages and losses to infrastructure from the destruction that Russia's military is causing. And the latest report is from June 2023, and it accounts the total damages to residential and non-residential real estate and other infrastructure at around $150 billion at replacement cost. To give you an idea of what that amount means, Ukraine's GDP pre-war, pre-full-scale invasion 2021 was around 200 billion. And it's remarkable that this really is a war against people, because around 40% of what has been damaged is residential buildings. Like, you know. And then if you look at the amount of losses incurred by Ukraine due to loss of income and other sectors of the economy, and other additional costs and future losses, that amounts to around 265 billion in the latest estimate. And in terms of what those losses look like, the largest losses were incurred in the assets of enterprises and industry at around 20% of all different losses. And that's going right at the economy. And then the second largest amount there is agriculture and land resources at around 15%. And if you look at the nature of the Ukrainian export economy, it is a country that feeds people. It's the breadbasket. Agriculture is the largest sector. And there's also colossal potential in that sector, especially with European integration and improvements in productivity gains. So like really important parts of the economy. And of course, a key point here is that these losses are not even. They are very much concentrated in the eastern regions, where a huge amount of industry and economic production regions, Donetsk foremost, followed by Kharkiv, where my relatives live, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kyiv in that order. And I would encourage everyone, if you haven't done this, Google Maps has now been updated for Mariupol, and it's of course now occupied by Russia. If you haven't, I encourage you to look at the satellite imagery, because I can tell you these numbers. It's very different to look at them. This is of course total destruction, and the destruction of, assets that employed thousands of people that built an economy. So gone. So you have to think about then what it means to reconstruct that. But we have to consider, I want to just make clear, not just the physical infrastructure, but society. So people have been brutalized, they've been traumatized. This too needs consideration as part of reconstruction, social services, other supports. So when we think of reconstruction, I think we really, really have to pay attention to the social side. And a final point is that reconstruction and recovery is inherently place-based. It takes local capacity and community, and we know from other brutal conflicts, things can be rebuilt, especially if there's an economy underpinning reconstruction. And in Ukraine's case, there is. I'm quite confident. I mean, this is a really rich in mineral and mining and agriculture and other resources. And reconstruction and recovery is possible and already being done where there is safety and economy, infrastructure. We know from other conflicts that this is all possible, and people will come back. And in recent polls, Ukrainians who are living abroad, who have fled, continue to express their overwhelming preferences to move back. Some places will no longer exist, but others will, and Ukraine is already reconstructing. If you look at the pictures of places like Bucha and Izium, they have been reconstructed. So the needs foremost are, of course, security, physical capital, but also social capital, expertise, a wide range of training route for reconstruction. And the emphasis I want to place is on understanding place and community, that real local and regional development, which is something that Ukraine is strengthening since 2014. Territorial development and decentralization are these key demands of the Revolution of Dignity, that these reforms are very critical. They have been disruptive, capacities differ, but if you want to be effective, that's where that reconstruction has to come from.
Thank you, Tamara. It's always very difficult to think about reconstruction during times of war, but there is simply no other choice. I'm going to return back to you in the next round about more questions to that last point you mentioned on decentralization and the importance of that, especially during this ongoing phase of reconstruction. But let's first turn again to Natalie and focus a bit more on European defense and security. Now, Natalie, since February 2022, there has undoubtedly been a significant increase in European defense spending. At the same time, there is a trend of growing dependence on the US in terms of defense capacities. How does this impact the EU's aspirations for strategic autonomy? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. And before I answer that question, actually, I wanted to share very briefly something that I heard the other day in relation to what Tamara was now saying and your last comment, Leo, about reconstruction during war. I was having a meeting with the French special envoy for Ukraine's reconstruction, and he said something to me which I actually thought was quite important. He said we should actually stop talking about reconstruction because of precisely the point, Leon, that you were mentioning. In our very 1990s liberal international order kind of frame of the world in which change was linear and, in conflicts there was violence, and after violence there was a peace settlement, and after a peace settlement there would be reconstruction, and then there would be stabilization, and then there would be transformation, and then what a wonderful world it would be. Now, obviously, kind of, war and peace don't actually work that way, right? And we've kind of woken up to that reality. But reconstruction is imbued in that frame of mind. So he was saying that one should talk about it, and it becomes a real problem because indeed, it's not so much a problem of the public sector, but especially of the private sector. How do you induce today the private sector to invest in Ukraine? And in Ukraine's, we could call it reconstruction, right? Because at the moment, indeed, the concept is, war, no one goes there unless you're someone who's already there, yeah, and actually knows that in many parts of the country you can work perfectly well, right? And so he was saying, well, we should start talking about it in terms of economic resilience rather than reconstruction. I mean, sort of trying to convey a sense that there are things that can be done that are actually, from a private sector perspective, can actually be quite profitable as well, right? And it is something that can go on even as war goes on. And I think it's a frame in mind that as academics, we should also contribute to, because otherwise, in narrative terms, right, in discursive terms, we also become part of a problem, yeah, which is actually preventing or slowing down basically those forces from entering Ukraine. Anyway, that was a side note. But onto your defense question. Yes, indeed, I think you kind of point to a paradox. And I think that paradox really also has to do with, if you're assessing Europe's role, yeah, I mean, what are you assessing this against? Yeah, what's your parameter for effectiveness or otherwise, for good or bad, right? Because indeed, if the parameter is ourselves, right, or our past, then of course, we've been doing fantastically well, right? As you say, defense spending has gone back up, we have a European peace facility. And look, even compared to the United States, when the war began, or rather when the large-scale war began, the United States by far outstripped all European countries, UK included, put together, right? And now, actually, if you take economic and military assistance together, we by far outstrip the United States. And I would add, as it should be, right? I mean, this is a European war, and it's only right and fair that it's mainly Europeans that are responsible for it. And you see that as these 2 years have gone on, that gap has narrowed. Now we've actually overtaken the United States. Of course, we are still in a position in which, if the United States were to disappear tomorrow morning, or rather, I should say in November, or January 2025, then we would still be in trouble. But that gap has been narrowing. So if you take as a parameter, ourselves or our past, then we've been doing very well. However, if you take as a parameter what is needed, and here I come to Mick's point, which was really about what is needed to do what exactly? What is needed to prevent Ukraine from losing, or what is needed to ensure that Ukraine wins? Well, especially if you take that second parameter, well, we've been doing really badly, right? I mean, we've clearly not put our economies on a war footing, quite unlike Russia. I mean, it is clear that if you take European collectively, sort of how much we spend on defense, you compare that with Russia, there should be no match whatsoever in theory. And yet in practice, it's exactly the other way around. In practice, Europeans collectively have been providing Ukraine with as much ammunition as North Korea has been providing Russia. I mean, North Korea, this is amongst the most sanctioned, sort of countries in the world. And it has been doing as much as, 27, or again, if you add the UK, 28 of the most rich countries in the world. So this is pathetic, but if you take a different standard. So, again, sort of to come back to your question, I think the paradox is explained by what is your criteria? What's the parameter? And on one level, we've been doing very well. On another, which is more external, sort of set of parameters, but which at the end of the day is what matters. I mean, what matters is not, patting ourselves in the back because we've been doing relatively well compared to our past. What matters is how this war will end. And on that second, criterion, things are not looking very pretty.
Thank you,
I told you that my optimism was going to go.
You did warn us. You warned us. And thank you for the analogy also on North Korea, because I do think that puts a lot of things into perspective. Let's turn again to Mick Cox again. Mick, you've done so much research on both China and Russia. China has provided unwavering support for Russia. What factors have contributed to China's stance, and how significant is this support in the context of the broader international response to the war? Thank you.
This also might link into your earlier question, Leon, on what we got wrong. I mean, I don't want to get into polemics with old colleagues and academics, but I mean, there was a general view amongst quite a lot of academics that the China-Russia relationship was only convenient, purely transactional, didn't have any profound basis to it. And it seems to me, and I'm not saying I got proved right and my colleagues got proved wrong, but if I'm honest about it, I kind of would say that if the war has tested anything, it has been that relationship. And while China has been, let's say, diplomatically adroit in some areas, talking about peace, while it said we're not giving direct military aid to Russia, and while it has said that it actually wants to have good relations with Ukraine at some point in the future, as it did before the war began. I mean, after all, China and Ukraine did have important economic relations. Nonetheless, one of the key factors in this war, which is not often spoken about enough, though increasingly it is, I think, is China's relationship to the war, China's relationship to Russia, most importantly, Putin's relationship to Xi Jinping. And what I argued many, many years ago, and I won't be boring the listeners here or viewers here too much on it, I wrote an article back in 2016, basically saying, I think that this relationship is real, it'll be deep, and it will get deeper. And it's become deeper over a very long term. And that's what I try to do in the book. I'm trying to write on that as well. It starts in the 80s and the 1990s. An important rapprochement takes place by the end of the 1990s with the 2001 agreement on friendship. It continues under Putin and Xi. And if you actually look at Putin and Xi together, taken over that 20-year period, they kind of agree on most things. It's not just on Russia, why they think NATO is to blame. It's not just that China just repeats largely the Russian narrative on the war. It's also they agree on nearly every other international issue. Not every single one, but you go back. Votes in the UN on Syria, votes on Libya, votes on sanctions, votes on the global south. You go back, multipolarity, the basic belief that the United States is the real cause of all the problems in the world, that liberalism is the cause of all problems in the world. There's a kind of a big meeting of minds and a big meeting of strategic outlooks and ideological outlooks between China and Russia, one of which is also one we shouldn't underestimate, and it's an interesting problem. I think they also think that history is on their side. And people shouldn't underestimate this. There's a kind of sense they believe the West is in decline. The United States is in decline. Europe is definitely divided and is going to go into decline, whereas they are on the right side of history, and that history is going their direction. And they kind of see the rise of the BRICS and what's going on as kind of indicative of the shaping of a historical narrative about which they both agree. So although Russia has suffered enormously, as has been pointed out, not as much as Ukraine, of course, nonetheless, they still believe that in some senses, this history is on their side. Now, there's another dimension to this, which brings in Ukraine back into the narrative. I think the Ukraine war, the first one, and now this one, beginning in 2014 and now the one in 2022, has solidified this relationship in important ways. And it's not just me who's done this, but a lot of other academics and policymakers. If you look at the relationship up to 2014, that was the moment when China had to make a big decision over the whole question of Crimea and over the whole question of Eastern Ukraine. And although they didn't come down in a kind of way of saying, well, we think it's a wonderful thing what Russia's done in taking over and annexing Ukraine, nonetheless, their main blame about why it started was directed against the West and the United States and NATO expansion. And after 2014, you see the relationship consolidate. Just to finish the story, and it's a very long story, so I won't go on for far too long, Leon. It also consolidates itself in February at the beginning of the war. Remember the Beijing Olympics? Remember the 4th of February communique between Putin and Xi? The very fact that Russia postponed its invasion until the Olympics were over, and then the invasion occurs 2 to 3 days after the Olympics are over. Now, we don't know what was fully said, but what we do know is what's happened since. China has repeated the Russian narrative. Its economic relations with Russia have increased. There's been dual-use technologies, which have become an important part of the Russian war effort. And also China has a huge role in international organizations and in global narratives. And basically the narrative they've put forward over the war, and indeed on the world as a whole, is that largely the cause of all this is unipolarity. The cause of this is the United States. The cause of this is NATO. And that until the United States and the Europeans stop supporting Ukraine, we can then get peace, but that's peace at Ukraine's price. So I think that tells us a lot. And I kind of tragically and kind of pessimistically kind of think that relationship is going to get deeper. And its significance, I think, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world, we can see it over other major international issues, is going to get stronger as long as Putin is in office, which is going to be for a long time, I imagine, and Xi is in office, which is going to be for a long time as well.
Thank you, Mick. I think I broadly agree with most of your points. I would be very interested to see also researchers taking a very deep dive, asking the question, cui bono, who benefits? Specifically in relation to that relationship between China and Russia, and looking at how much Russia has given away in the process in order to meet some of its short-term goals in relation
if I could just
war.
jump in on that, Leon, without interrupting you and taking up too much time. In some ways, I mean, China's view is that Putin cannot lose. They just cannot allow Putin to lose, because Xi has put so much and invested so much into this relationship. 40 meetings over 10, 20, 12 years, growing, everything they say together indicates that they cannot allow Putin to lose, and they cannot allow what they see as the Americans and the West win. So has it benefited China? In many ways it has benefited China, let's be perfectly honest. It's got a strategic partner which is of some importance. Let's not underestimate it. You know, Russia's a nuclear power. It's got a veto in the Security Council, blah, blah, blah. They've got a long border, and that is now stabilized. But Russia has also benefited, because I actually think that the China role, direct and indirect, has been far more significant than I think some analysts have sometimes been prepared to concede.
Thank you, Mick. Okay, let's turn again to tomorrow, and we'll focus on Ukraine. Now, in 2014, Ukraine started with a process of decentralization reforms. What has been the impact of, excuse me, actually, I actually want to go back to another question first before we go to decentralization. I want to ask you about the energy environment. How has the February 2022 escalation transformed Ukraine's energy environment, and how do you see the future of Ukraine's energy? Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you. Dr. Cox, that was super interesting, your remarks. I want to just chime in on the last question before I go forward, that we need to pay more attention to Central Asia as well. There isn't enough scholarship, particularly in English there, and that is an area of contestation between China and Russia. And my friends there say we're between, what do they say, tiger and a bear or something like that. So we do need more Central Asian scholarship to let us know what is happening on the ground in those areas of contestation. So energy policy is so interesting. It's a super complex area. I'm learning about it now because I'm working with postdoctoral fellow Yuri Koretsky and interviewing energy policy experts in Ukraine to understand what's changing. And why the angle I'm taking on this is that we always think of institutional persistence, and we certainly think of persistence when it comes to massive infrastructure like energy infrastructure. And yet this has been an incredibly colossal, quick time of change. And all those countries that said it was impossible, we have to rely on cheap Russian oil and gas, they've been proven that that was never the case. They never had to actually do that. They could have been much smarter, and they changed quickly and pivoted, and Ukraine is having to pivot really quickly. So in a nutshell, before the war, about 55% of the balance was occupied by nuclear generation in Ukraine. Around 30 was thermal power plants that worked on thermal coal and partly on natural gas. And around 11% was hydropower, and the rest was different types of alternative energy sources. And a lot of the problems in Ukrainian energy sector was in heat generation sector, which was generally built around the mid-60s. And the units, a lot of the units have been decommissioned for a number of reasons. They were past due. And then there's been the introduction of a green tariff in Ukraine that has led to a significant increase in the share of generation from renewable sources, but it's also led to various imbalances, and it's hard to ensure Ukraine's internal needs. Before the war, demand for electricity was completely covered by domestic production, but of course, a lot has changed. So Russia is targeting intensively Ukraine's energy infrastructure, particularly when it's cold, when they hope people will freeze. And they blew up the hydropower, Kakhovka Dam, and they now Russia occupies, of course, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which is in fact the 10th largest in the world. And it generated around half the power of the country, and it's not generating power now. They took it offline. So the energy, there's a whole bunch of things happening in the energy sector in Ukraine. There's these older large assets. There's the issue of energy security. There's how to be more resilient, and you need decentralized energy systems to be able to do that. Russians have just so easily, look at them, they've knocked out half the country's energy by taking that nuclear power plant. One of the reasons why electricity production isn't so problematic at the moment is that demand for energy has decreased by around 30% because industrial facilities and residential buildings have been destroyed. And also because so many people have had to flee. So there's a mix, and the mix is changing. There is a new national energy and climate plan, which is being supported by donor governments to the tune of around 50 billion, I presume. And it contains a set of new policies and measures that meet the goals of the European Union, both in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing energy efficiency and developing renewables. So this is kind of this new emerging field, very quick. And I just want to share a quote from one of the energy experts we interviewed, because he says what he needs. He says, we need the support of government structures of various levels, local authorities, state authorities, to prepare documents and strategic and operational plans. Until 2014, Ukraine was very energy dependent on oil, gas, petroleum products. Everyone understands the need to move to decarbonization. It may happen that we move from energy dependence, though, to technological dependence. And so it's very important that when the EU finances the construction of things like solar and wind power plants, that part of the production is implemented in Ukraine. This will create new jobs, taxes, development. So they're really isolating that they don't want to move from one form of energy dependence to another form of technological dependence, and they want homegrown capacity. And I think that's an important point to make. In general, what I'm seeing from the interviews is a really strong goals that are aligned with European integration. A lot of things have to change in the regulatory framework to make things work, but a lot of growing flexibility and commitment to broader energy security and the decentralization that entails.
Thank you, Tamara, and also for pointing out how this crisis essentially this war rather, has sort of facilitated the decision-making in a variety of sectors, decisions that have been hanging there for a very long time. I know, Natalie, you're going to be very excited also to talk about energy, so I'm going to ask you to piggyback on what Tamara said, but maybe, situate the energy discussion in the context of the region in Europe, especially. Now, you've made the point in your chapter that following the February escalation, Russia's manipulation of energy exports, that Europe's energy resilience has been fundamental to maintaining unity. Now, how effective have the EU measures been, specifically in diversifying energy sources and ensuring economic stability? And what potential challenges does the EU face in the coming months in terms of energy security? Thank you.
So, I think, Leon, that this, again, going back to a slightly more positive version of the story, energy is actually even more than defense, I would say, the one thing in which it's difficult to see how we could have done any better. I mean, on defense, you could say, well, as I was saying earlier, we've done a lot, but not enough. on energy, frankly speaking, and here, you know, sort of this connects to a point that Tamara was making, you know, when this all began, you know, sort of people thought, well, it's impossible, you know, there's no way that we will be able to survive without Russian gas. You know, I remember at the time, I was sitting on the board of ENI, an Italian energy major, and I asked them, you know, so what's going to happen if Russia kind of, you know, turns off the taps? And you know, the first answer that you would get is, well, that's never going to happen. I mean, it's just so, you know, against their interests that they will never do it. And I was like, well, you know, just for the sake of argument, you know, what would happen? And they were like, you know, I mean, this is going to be, you know, not so much for the company, because actually, but this would take us in a different direction. It actually gained quite a lot of money by severing that energy relationship with Russia, but this would get us in a different direction. But, you know, the Italy and Europe, I mean, it would be an utter, you know, it would be catastrophic. And that was just all wrong, right? I mean, you know, when push comes to shove, back to the wall, you've got no choice, because of course, as we know, it was not, I mean, both Europe and Russia, let's be very clear, militarized energy. I mean, we did it with our oil sanctions, the price cap. I mean, regardless of the fact that it didn't work, yeah, but we did weaponize, right? We did weaponize energy. And of course, Russia weaponized energy by eventually, you know, turning off that tap and doing what we thought was unthinkable. And when it did, well, you know, we responded. And, you know, sort of, we responded in what ways? Essentially, sort of three sets of ways. Energy security through a reduction of consumption. Now, this is largely because, of course, not as dramatic as in the case of Ukraine, where consumption has gone down because industries have been shut down and you know, buildings destroyed and all the rest of it. Obviously, that has not been the case of Europe, but we do know that there's been an economic slowdown in Europe, and that has translated in a reduction of consumption. However, which obviously is not good news, right? However, there is a good news to a reduction of consumption as well, which is the fact that for the very first time, energy efficiency, which was always the ugly duckling of the decarbonization agenda, started becoming, you know, it started making economic sense to invest in energy efficiency, right? Because there wasn't a lot of cheap gas going around. And once those investments in efficiency are made, you see that the reduction of consumption becomes structural. And that's exactly what happened. You know, now we have gas prices, which, yes, you know, they're obviously still fairly high, but they've gone down tenfold, you know, from the peak of 300 euros per megawatt hour in August 2022. Now, you know, over the last year, it's been around 30 euros. Yes, of course, it's still 3 times higher than in the United States, but it's not dramatically different from the 20 euros per megawatt hour, you know, euros per megawatt hour that we had before the war began, right? And so I think there's an energy efficiency story, which is good news. There is the diversification story. So we have diversified our fossil relationships. And whether this is Qatar, the US, Canada, Algeria, Congo, Azerbaijan, you know, sort of. Now, you may say, well, many of these countries are horrible dictatorships, not Canada. Yes, it's true, but there are many horrible dictatorships, right? You're not putting all the eggs into one horrible dictator's basket, right? And so that in and of itself means that you're more secure. And then, of course, I think there's probably the most positive side of the story, which is the fact that whereas there was a risk that as energy security came back on the agenda, the energy transition would go out, that has not happened. And you basically see a very significant acceleration in the investment in renewables over the course of the last 2 years, more so than what would have been the case had the war not happened. So it's not just that it's an upward trend full stop. No, it's a trend that has actually gone even higher as a consequence of the war, and of course the price incentives that has generated. So, you know, on a whole, I actually think that whatever angle you look at it, both through the energy security angle and through the energy transition angle, the war has been, to use Jean Monnet's expression, sort of or citation of, Europe is going to be the sum of the solutions of the crises it will face. This has been a crisis that has been, quote unquote, well used, right, by the EU and indeed by Ukraine, I would say.
Thank you, Natalie. I think that's great news on the front of diversification of the energy sector, especially given how much Putin has invested over the last few years in using energy as a weapon to divide the transatlantic community. Mick, let's turn to you again, and I'm going to sprinkle in a question also from our audience members. I do appreciate we're having quite a number of questions. I have to be selective, unfortunately, because there are some of these issues that we'll discuss in future Russia-Ukraine dialogues. But Mick, let me ask you this. Your chapter in Russia's war and the future of the global order suggests that the war has wider implications for the international system. You've also alluded to that earlier. Can you elaborate on how the conflict in Ukraine has not only impacted Europe, but also led to division in the global order?
Yeah.
And then related to that, I want to ask you this question from an audience member, Munir Majid, who's asking, how would you compare the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza in terms of being the quote-unquote most defining of the 21st century?
Yeah.
Putting you there on the spot, Mix.
Yeah, not really. No, it's a good question. I know Munir. Thanks, Munir, for that question. I'll come on to that in a while. Because they are connected, because it raises the question of double standards, and particularly in the global south, and we've got to face up to that. The West has been, strong on Ukraine in spite of the limits of its support. On the other hand, it's backed Israel in the war, and therefore it raises the whole question of double standards, and you can't get away from that, and you can't kind of shy that particular question. I know, Natalie, you wrote about that in an article in the London Guardian, which I very much appreciated. And it does raise that. I don't know if one is more defining than the other. The only thing is that what I was writing about for a number of years was the Russia-Ukraine war, and that's the one I've focused on, not to ignore what's happening in the Middle East, which could be just as equally defining. And maybe both are connected in some way or another as well, though how the connections work is a bit more complicated. So I appreciate that point, Munir, but it's much we could discuss as well and take that one forward. On the question of its wider global consequences, and here I get back to the specifics on the wider global. Well, Tamara mentioned one, Central Asia. I mean, this is not an unimportant part of the world. And the 5 Central Asian republics, are all kind of working out what's going to be their relationship with the growing economic power of China on the one hand, but Russia's security requests and Russia's security relationship with them on the other hand, and how you get that balance right. So it's already had a big impact in the neighborhood, if I can use that term tomorrow, in Central Asian republics, and it's raised all sorts of questions to which there's no easy answer at the moment. Second obvious response, look at NATO. Look, I was told by a French president that NATO was brain dead before the invasion, and I wasn't sympathetic to that view, but I kind of got what he was getting at. Well, it doesn't look too brain dead at the moment, and indeed it's increased its numbers by 2 with the important addition of Finland and Sweden, and that is not insignificant. That is simply not insignificant. I think thirdly, and this may not come true by November, Natalie, will it? It strengthened the transatlantic relationship. After Afghanistan, the transatlantic relationship was in a bit of a mess because there were many Europeans who were not at all happy with the Biden decision to unilaterally decide to get out of Afghanistan, with the pretty appalling consequences that have followed since. So without sounding too cynical or manipulative or conspiratorial, the war in some ways gave new vitality to NATO and to the transatlantic relationship. I'd say one other thing, however, very briefly, because I know there's a lot of people out there want to ask questions. It's also had an enormous impact, and it gets back to Munir's question on the global south. The world is not entirely split north-south. I think that's too simplistic. That's overly simple. You look at the first vote in the UN, a number of countries in the so-called global south, voted against the war. Nonetheless, as one of the chapters in the book shows, Leon, the global south has not taken the same view on this war. It's been less condemning of Russia, or it's found rationalizations for explaining what Russia is doing. And then it brings up the double standards question. Why did the West get so excited about Ukraine when it doesn't get so excited or gets excited for the wrong reason over Israel and Gaza? So it brought the global South right into the mix of international relations in ways that I think we should have expected. I was talking about the BRICS a long time ago and saying this is going to be a very important organization, and that China and Russia will use the organization. Can't blame them for doing so. They want to increase their influence. But I think it's brought that into the debate. And what it's done is increase the division in the world. Let's be perfectly honest about it. You know, there is a very different, and Munir, I think, brings this up. You know, there's a very different perspective on this war. If you go to many Middle Eastern countries or to Malaysia, or you go down to other parts of the world, like in Latin America, their view of this war is different. And we've got to kind of come to terms with why it is different and explain it, not ignore it. And I think that's a very, very big task for all of us in the days and months coming ahead.
Thanks, Mick. Those are great points also, and definitely we do need to discuss the relationship between these two conflicts also, and how it will influence our policies going forward, our thinking going forward, and how that relates to how we engage the quote unquote global South. Now, let's do another lightning round of questions. I just wanted to ask panelists to just keep it relatively short, but then I think we have room for a few more questions. Tomorrow we'll start. We started with you, so we'll go again in this order. You've mentioned decentralization a number of times in relation to Ukraine, which of course started to kind of intensify in 2014. What has been the impact of Russia's full-scale invasion on that process, and why is the continuation of these reforms crucial for democracy, reconstruction, and European integration? And if you want to sprinkle anything in there also about key challenges for Ukraine for this coming year, for this year, please you know, feel free to allude to that. Thank you, Tamara.
Okay, so in a nutshell, why, you know, so I focus on regional territorial development in my work. I think it's important. I think it's fundamental to, well, as Europeans understand cohesion and competitiveness. Europe does decentralization, regional development well. And I have this picture, this photograph behind me. This is during the Revolution of Dignity. It's in the Central Maidan. And in a nutshell, why is this important? It's because it was a central demand of democracy and democracy, and to live in dignity, to have representation. And it's foundational to actually how Ukrainian society realistically on the ground organizes itself. So it's quite anesthetic to have these decisions being made on different types of local investments by an upper government. It just didn't make sense. It was inefficient. And so these decentralization reforms are part of that promise and to deliver well-being. And I really want to emphasize that these are very successful reforms that were started. There was new legislation and regulation, changes to the budget and tax codes, new regional development policy framework. There was voluntary amalgamations, a lot of efforts to increase local capacity, and financial incentives to amalgamate and for local governments to gain more control over local budgets and to work more effectively together. Like, this is a really positive story that I don't think enough people have heard about. And the OECD has done a lot of work on supporting the decentralization process and has surveyed municipalities that demonstrate that they have been building capacity and delivering services more effectively. And then the full-scale invasion began, and then martial law was declared, and it outlined some responsibilities for the different local governance in the context of a military administration, and to clarify different powers and so on. And so a lot of the things that were going to happen in the second round of decentralization reforms have been put on hold. I think that local governments and communities have demonstrated, again, capacity, how they have organized on the ground to support humanitarian efforts, to even organize defense has been like absolutely remarkable. And again, this comes down to the social fabric. And so in a sense, this full-scale invasion was a test of decentralization, and local governments have proven themselves to be responsive, agile, competent. So these reforms, I expect, will continue. And you mentioned briefly the key challenges for Ukraine in 2024. I mean, yeah, there's a lot. So to degrade the Russian army further, to take back territory, to protect civilians, to function as an economy, to maintain and expand infrastructure where possible, to be adaptable, to demonstrate that there is hope. There is hope. Ukrainians have hope. Don't lose hope because they have it. And that to demonstrate that Russia's army can be pushed back further, that land and people can be liberated, and to counter, this is a hybrid war, the many narratives that Russia daily pushes to abandon people and disrupt democracies. My God, and a country with an economy smaller than Canada can sure manage to be awfully disruptive, colossally disruptive. Let's put them in their place a little bit and let's actually fight this hybrid war. So I want to make a final point because we focus a lot on challenges that Ukraine faces. There are a lot of amazing things happening in Ukrainian society. I mean, they're colossally resilient. One thing that this war has demonstrated has been that the economy is highly competitive technologically, that the IT sector in Ukraine in 2023 grew to 8 billion, that it employed millions of people and it's increasing, that it's growing because IT is being implemented in different sectors of the economy. It's not just a source of work for foreign firms, but it's integrated into society. So I want to share, the challenges, but also the opportunity. And I've done a lot of regional development work in places like Poland that saw European integration. And I just see the future, and the future is like super optimistic for me of what could be achieved if Ukraine gained security and didn't have to fight for its survival.
Thanks. Yes, Tamara, those are all great points also. And thank you also for sprinkling in some optimistic factors into the mix. Let's turn again to Natalie for your final questions. Now, one of the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war is that it revived the discussion about EU enlargement. Ukraine and Moldova have recently been recognized as candidate countries. What are the challenges and opportunities for the EU in expanding its membership, especially in the context of the ongoing war? And then we also have a question from Gabor and Neil in our audience. What's the risk of Hungary and Viktor Orban's influence on EU cohesion when it comes to support for Ukraine? Thank you, Natalie. Great.
So on the challenge opportunity of enlargement point, let me put it in these terms also, not to take up too much time. This is enlargement up until Russia's large-scale invasion, or rather, I should say, between the end of the Big Bang enlargement, so let's say 2007, through to 2022. Of course, there was the enlargement to Croatia in 2013, but with the let's caveat that out, right? So for a fairly long time, basically, enlargement was very much viewed as a question of the pros and cons of enlargement. Should we enlarge? Should we not enlarge? And of course, the truth is that if you frame it in that way, the resistance against enlargement is always going to be overwhelming. I mean, unless you have, the enlargement to Norway, I mean, a kind of small, rich, unproblematic state where the pros obviously outweigh the cons. But in any other case, this is beyond Ukraine, whether this is Turkey, Balkans, there's always going to be a very strong force against enlargement. Now, what the war did is completely turn that discussion on its head, So it was no longer a question of the pros and cons. It became a sort of, actually, do we have an alternative? Is there an alternative to enlargement? When enlargement does not happen, given that there isn't some sort of safe and stable buffer zone, some sort of stable gray zone, and it's a frontier, you're either on one side or you're on the other. And if you're on the other side of the frontier, all sorts of nasty things can happen, like being invaded by Russia. And those nasty things don't simply are not simply contained, they have spillover effects, as obvious is the case, throughout the continent. And so enlargement became a strategic imperative. Now, once that debate turned, all of a sudden it became a conversation in terms of also the enlargement reform nexus, rather than what it used to be before, which was, oh, yes, it would be a very nice idea to enlarge. However, I'm so sorry, but we first need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, as, up until Z. And so I'm sorry, up until when we do that, enlargement cannot happen. Now the discussion is now, given that we have to enlarge, there is no question about that. What are the reforms that are necessary in order to make this happen? What's the bare minimum that we have to do? And so it becomes a far more pragmatic conversation about what needs to be done in terms of ensuring institutional representation, what needs to happen in terms of decision-making and the revision of decision-making. Let me just weave into that the Hungary question, which, this also connects to debates on qualified majority voting. However, and this very much relates to the Hungary question, okay, let me just finish the train of thought. And what needs to happen in terms of the policies, in particular, those policies that have a budget implication, common agricultural policy, cohesion policy. Now, once you break down that discussion, you realize very quickly that there are some things that you have no choice, you really have to do. Yeah, you need to figure out, whatever, if Ukraine becomes a member, how many MEPs they would have sitting in the European Parliament. You need to figure out what's the name of the game in terms of the number of commissioners. Now, the good part of this is that actually there are already answers to all of these absolute musts, yeah, because the Lisbon Treaty itself has an annex which actually specifies what needs to happen, right? Now, it was never implemented because enlargement did not happen, right? But there, there is already, it is already there, the fact that no, member states do not necessarily need to have a commissioner per member state. So that's the absolute bare minimum. Then you get into the nice to have reforms. So it would be nice for the European Union to move towards qualified majority voting. And you know what? It would be nice for it to do it even before enlargement, right? And this connects to the Hungary point. However, it's not a deal breaker for enlargement itself, right? Even now with Hungary, I mean, he just kind of, Orban just leaves the room. There are ways and means to do this. Now, if you ask me on qualified majority voting, or rather getting away from unanimity, especially as it relates to enlargement, I think we will never get away from the fact that when a new member enters, there will be a unanimous vote on this. This is a treaty change, yeah? I mean, you're not going to escape that. Even if you get qualified majority voting on foreign policy and taxation and lots of great things. Now, what you can get rid of is a unanimous vote for the opening and closing of all chapters of negotiations, yeah, which is basically 35 times 2. There is no need. I mean, the treaty does not specify that to open and close every single negotiation chapter, you need to have unanimity. And that dilutes very significantly the current problem, which is the Orban problem, but also the future problem. I don't know, the Vučić problem, right? Or whatever, the Le Pen problem. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be a new member that is obnoxious. It can be an old member that is obnoxious, right? Now, then you have, I think, this third set of issues, which in many respects is actually the thorniest one, which is the policy-related ones, and in particular the budget ones. Now, there, I think, again, to be very pragmatic as far as Ukraine is concerned, because, again, here there is a Ukraine and everyone else conversation. Everyone else, meaning all the Western Balkan countries, Moldova, Georgia, I mean, let's bracket out Turkey for the time being. All of those countries put together are smaller than the UK, right? We could accept Moldova in tomorrow morning and pay for it, and no one would notice. Yeah, I mean, this is tiny. This is a tiny problem. Even if it's an economic, disaster in many ways, it's a tiny economic disaster. So very easy to handle. Ukraine is a different ballgame. And there, I think it's going to be a question of having some sort of grand bargain. For example, I mean, we had the reconstruction or maybe resilience sort of conversation earlier. could one basically say, well, look, given that it's the EU that's going to be mainly paying for Ukraine's economic reconstruction, and it will do so off budget, yeah, next gen EU-like mechanism, could we say that for the first MFF in which Ukraine would be a member of the European Union, so basically the 2028 onwards MFF, that for that first cycle, Ukraine would not be fully integrated in the European budget as far as the common agricultural policy and cohesion funds are concerned, because we're going to be paying for Ukraine in other ways, right? So I think, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. And the will is there now. We just need to make sure that that will is sustained over time.
Thank you, Natalie. Those are great points, I think, and it boils down to how do we change decision-making within the EU, you know, based on current conditions, and perhaps NATO should also look at some of those questions. Mick, let's turn to you to close us off. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions of the audience members. Mick, given the ongoing war and its positions taken by Russia, China, and the West, what is your assessment regarding potential future scenarios in the international system, especially in terms of power dynamics and alliances? And I would be particularly interested in how you think the war changed BRICS as well as NATO's alliance with Indo-Pacific partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Thank you, Mick.
So how many days do you have, Leon, for me to try and answer all of that together? Okay, no, I'll take 1 minute. I think there's no question that it, you know, whatever the things we've been talking about, NATO enlargement, the transatlantic relationship, you know, this particular war has deep and profound long-term global consequences, and they're being worked out throughout the whole system. In the global South, I think it's also created a world system which was already pretty unstable. And it's been unstable, I think, since 2001. It's been unstable since the 2008 crisis. It was made more unstable by Brexit. It was made more unstable by the Trump election. And it's going to be made even more unstable by the question that Munir raised quite correctly on the ongoing tragic war that's going on in the Middle East and in the Gaza, Israel. We're living in what I think somebody has called, Adam Tooze, the LSE trained historian now at Columbia, said, we're living in the midst of a polycrisis. And this gets back to pessimism, Natalie. I can be even more pessimistic than you at the moment on this, because to all of the things we talked about, of which Ukraine is a part, it's part of a global disorder. It's part of a whole way in which the global order we thought was coming into being, or at least people in the West thought was coming into being in the 1990s, has not come into being. And to that, we should even add other things. We haven't even begun to touch on what's going to happen in Taiwan, even after these elections. You know, we haven't begun to touch on some of the massive multiple crises going on inside Africa at the moment, particularly in Sudan, which is a country in meltdown. You know, and it seems to me, and this is where I do get very pessimistic, Natalie, it also gets back to the United States. Now, whoever is going to win in November, it's not to say the Americans are going to solve every problem. They're not doing it in the Middle East, and they're not going to do it anywhere else in the world. And whether the American people even want to do it, I'm not even sure about. But the question is, solving these problems almost must inevitably involve the United States, whichever way you look at the United States. And at the moment, you know, Biden has done the best he could. I'm being generous at the moment, by the way. He's not done very well over the Middle East, I have to be perfectly honest. But with a polarized America being as polarized as it is, it's difficult to think long-term of easy resolution to any of these multiple connected crises. And so I'm afraid I do end, Natalie, on a rather down note, because whoever wins the election in the United States is going to have a shaping in the world, and the world is going to shape that election. And I'm afraid it's not going to be in a direction which I find particularly conducive to the kind of decent world that I want everybody to live in.
Thank you, Mick, and thank you to all three of your contributions. I think all three of our panelists, Dr. Tamara Kravchenko, Dr. Natalie Tocci, and Professor Mick Cox, you've been wonderful today. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I think my colleague will also just put the QR code on the screen for those of you who would like to download the LSE publication dedication that we mentioned earlier in this discussion. To our audience, thank you also for joining us. Please join us again on the 30th of January for a Russia-Ukraine dialogue that will focus specifically on the role of Ukrainian women on the front lines. We will explore contributions of female soldiers, politicians, and journalists to the war effort. Thank you, everyone, again, and goodbye.